So today we're going to be talking about holistic water management for farms, and this goes far beyond what is commonly associated with managing water, which usually comes down to having somewhat of a water budget, hoping that it rains, pumping the rest out of the ground, installing broader and broader irrigation systems, and hoping things go well. I think we can do a lot better. We must do a lot better with the challenges that we're facing with the hydrological cycle changes over, well, all of the climate change symptoms that we're seeing. And with that said, let's talk about how this is affecting Europe specifically. So, though we're going to focus on the context of farming here, the water crisis in Europe is affecting everybody. Every year we are seeing the cycle of drought and flood. And Nick, are you able to let the people in the
Yes, I'm letting people in.
Okay, super. Thanks for being on that. And these cycles are becoming more pronounced. They're causing longer term issues. And the general trend all around the world, though the climate is getting slightly warmer, noticeably in different areas, the water cycle has been broken, oftentimes in a way that has completely changed the local climate patterns, the microclimates, the rainfall patterns. And this is something that people are dealing with every single year, whether it is drought, flood, or sometimes even fire. Now, the food industry is the largest user of water worldwide, consuming far more than is available on an annual renewable basis. In fact, most of the world's food-producing regions are in a state of chronic water scarcity with no end in sight given current rates of production and levels of agricultural inefficiency. So the increase in frequency and severity of droughts is the one that I just mentioned. The over-extraction of groundwater goes closely along with this. As rainfall patterns become less reliable, we're needing to make up that shortfall and extracting water from the ground. Water pollution is a symptom of intensification of agriculture, the increased use of chemicals, and also incorrect management of animal waste very often. The rising demand for water is not unique to farms. The urban areas and the extraction that is caused from the landscape to manage population growth is also a contributor. Especially in Europe, one of the other things we're seeing is aging water infrastructure. A lot of this stuff was put in way before some of the more modern materials that can prevent leakages. And in Barcelona alone, which is the context I'm most familiar with, there is some 800,000 liters of water lost just to leakages every single day. The fragmented management of water also means that there is discontinuous and non-conducive ways of distributing water along changes in socioeconomic lines. So there might be jurisdiction of water from one area, not in another county, and it's being used up too far upstream. It doesn't make it all the way down. And these incoherences in between political lines is causing a lot of havoc. And all of this, as one of the symptoms, is going into the biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation. So first of all, why are we talking about this? So as I said before, I'm Oliver Goshey, and I have been working in ecological restoration in one form or another for well over a decade. And in the last 5 years, have really focused on the farm context. I have been all over the world. Some of these pictures are from France, Nicaragua, Portugal, and where I live here in Spain, helping people to recover the function of their hydrological systems through a wide range of techniques and management strategies. I first really came to understand the necessity of this when I was living in Guatemala and designing houses for people, and realizing that though we got almost a meter of rain, it all fell in a single wet season, and it was increasingly difficult to stretch that into the very long dry season. And as I got more involved with, well, my own farm project here in Spain and helping through consultations and coaching and design of other producers, realizing that this is an issue that all of us are facing. I hand it over to my colleague Nick for his introduction here.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Nick Steiner, And I've spent roughly the last 10 years working in the field of water and regeneration. So starting with kind of smaller projects and then kind of working our way up to now some of the farms that we're working with from 500 up to 700 hectares. So different kind of scales. And my real passion for water arrived when I moved to the island of Tenerife on the Canary Islands. That was around 7 years ago. And there we only get an average of 280 millimeters of rain every year. And the place where I'm living is fully off grid, so not even a well, so it's only rainwater. And throughout the last year, we only got 80 millimeters of total rain. And so you can imagine if all that water needs to come from the roof, it's really tricky. And so I'm spending kind of every day trying new methods and figuring out everything we can do to use rainwater that we have, but then also store it in a good way, reuse it through gray water systems. And for all the plants, I'm also working with different clients and on my own property filtration systems, but also smart irrigation systems. So yeah, basically for me, the main challenge is if I don't make it work, I have no way of living at my place. So that's why the passion is so big. And that's also why now we're really focusing full time on the topic of water. And during that time, I've also, together with Oliver, been working at Climate Farmers for roughly 3 years. There, I've been responsible for building the educational side of the Climate Farmers Academy, and there worked with the team and got to know a lot of farmers. So now it's really nice that now the time after Climate Farmers, I still get to work with lots of the awesome people in the network, and it's a big passion to help people with water, as that is becoming a more pressing issue around the globe. And that's also what I want to talk about now, because the focus for pretty much everyone in the global debate around the climate, it's always just carbon. And luckily that is changing over the last years. And when we look at the things that are really causing damage, it's the droughts, the fires, and the floods. And when those things happen, that's where we see real damage. And the main connecting factor between these is water. And water can be extremely damaging, but it can also be extremely great and beneficial. And it's all a question of how we manage our land. And so that's what we want to go into a bit today. So land management is a big topic because as humans, we have been really great at kind of destroying land over a long period of time. So many of the landscapes that we have nowadays are not looking like this great green one that we can see here, but rather a bit more like this. So we have lots of trees that have been cut down, everything has been destroyed. And the main issue is that it's not just the areas that are wild, but it's also going a bit further. And when we look at the cities and what we've done there, so we basically create these concrete jungles, we create monocultures of intensively used land. And the main problem is that this is not just bad for heating, and it doesn't just cause heat islands and these kind of things in the local areas. A main problem is also how we treat the land where we grow our food and the things we do there. And one really pressing example is here. This is one on the travel to one of my projects where we were working. This is close to Madrid. And you can clearly see on the Iberian Peninsula what this looks like. So in a natural system, generally the ecosystem tries to move up in succession. So more plants are trying to get established. Ground is tried, so nature is trying to cover the ground with vegetation, and we're constantly pushing back the vegetation. So we're often growing plants that are not appropriate for the area. We're creating massive monocultures. So also in these areas, you can see massive olive monocultures and others. So basically, we're taking all the cover away from the land, and we're making it really, really difficult for water to get into the land. And so what happens is that this soil heats up incredibly well. So I guess all of you have noticed the difference between blank soil when it heats up and a nice forest. So what happens is the soil gets baked, it gets really, really hot, and that also creates kind of like a concrete layer on top. And so when it rains, what happens is that all this water can't infiltrate, but rather it just starts flowing down. And there's a kind of a saying that a drought is just a flood waiting to happen. And this is what we're clearly seeing. And when we now look at the bigger scale, so also looking there at cities, You see here kind of visualized in all these images from Water Stories, one of the companies that I'm working at now, is we create these heat domes. So what happens is we have high pressure zones above the naked soil, but also kind of above the cities. And what happens is that these heat zones are not letting any of the nice moist air coming in from the sea or from other areas. So we have a lot of force that pushes kind of the lighter moisture out of the area. And what happens when no moisture can get into the soil, we get fires. So everything heats up. What we're trying to do is kind of pump more water from the ground. We're still plowing our fields, and it keeps getting worse. And so what happens is in these kind of areas that only the strongest storms get through. And when that happens, we have a lot of soil destruction. We have erosion that's getting worse and worse. So all this water can't infiltrate. There's no vegetation. There's no soil for it to get into. And what we see at the end of that is unfortunately really clear. And especially in Europe over the last weeks, the sign has been, pretty much commonplace, because all this water that can't infiltrate in vegetated areas that are designed to handle it, it just flows down until it can't flow any further. And that's where we see the flooding. And so we can clearly see that land management has a massive effect on what happens with water. And if we focus a lot more on water, we could solve a lot of things. Because at the moment, we're pretty much stuck in this kind of system where we have heat domes, we have heated up lands, only the massive storms come in. When they are there, they cause problems. And because they are not happening regularly, the soil is not really hydrated. We see fires and the land just gets destroyed. So generally, we can see that we're kind of stuck in a cycle. And this cycle can kind of be described as a drought, fire, and flood cycle. So we have a drought, no moistures in the landscape. Next thing that happens is, for whatever reason, it starts burning. There's a lot of causes for that, but basically all of you know firewood needs to be dry. So what happens to a forest when it's extremely dry? It just burns so much better. After it burns, and even the burning process sometimes seals the soil even further. I guess you all know from ceramics, or when you're working with clay, when you're burning the clay, it becomes really hard and can even be used kind of as in the kitchen to store water in it. And now imagine a massive fire, clay soils, everything gets burned. So next time it rains, this water can't infiltrate into the soil. So we're kind of stuck in the cycle, and it keeps getting worse and worse. And the main problem is that if we don't focus on water directly, but we're only taking the detour through these other measures and kind of a carbon tunnel vision, we're not going to get out of this cycle. We can probably lessen it a lot. So if we have less heat, also means less water in the atmosphere. That's great. And we definitely need to decarbonize. We need to bring as much carbon as we can into the soil. But if we forget to focus also on water, we have no chance of solving things fast enough. And I also want to look a bit kind of on the farm scale. So you can kind of look at your soil as your bank account. And a bank account, as you all know, if you're only taking water out to irrigate, at some point this bank account is going to run out. And it's the same with our aquifers. So we're seeing that all over the Iberian Peninsula, many of the aquifers are running out. Many areas are having water shortages. And then when we have these areas that are often using pivot irrigation, so basically these massive irrigation system where in kind of desert-like environments, a lot of water is used to grow crops that are not so appropriate for the area, just to keep them alive. We're depleting the soil further and further. And so we're kind of making this process a lot faster. And what we need to do is actually design our land in a way that they become a bank account that's filling up. So we need to recharge our bank accounts. And it's the main thing that we all as landowners, or at least as land managers, what we need to do. We need to design and structure the land in a way that we're filling our bank account up, because when we have a full bank account, and in this case, when we have it full of water, also when we need water for irrigation, we have it available and we can use it. If the account is empty, at some point, even the best irrigation system is not going to work because the water is just not available. And so what we need to do is create holistic management plans. So you probably know holistic management more from the animal side of things and from grazing management, but it also applies to water. So there is no silver bullet. There's not just one thing we can do. which is a big issue because when people think about water, especially in connection with permaculture, they just want to put swales everywhere and think that that's going to solve things. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. And we need to see different landscapes and different contexts, also different growing systems all require different strategies. And we need to see which one is appropriate. And we need to evolve them together with the landscape. We need to run small experiments and see how we can evolve the landscape. And what's great about that is we can slowly get back to a system of this entire water cycle. So we can restore the small water cycle, and we can see then we have water that goes into the ground. We have evapotranspiration, so water also goes up, so we can bring more water into the atmosphere. It can then move, it can rain further down in other areas. And so we have a nice cycle that keeps moisture in the air, but also in the soil. And so for you to make this really visual, what I want all of you to understand is we basically need to create sponges and pumps. That's the main thing we're always doing. So the soil needs to be a sponge that can take up as much water as possible. And then we also need the pumps, and pumps can be roots, but it can also be other different plants that can pull water from one layer in the soil, move it along through mycelium networks, and then through transpiration, also move it along so we can actually create much more water and fill up our bank accounts. And how we're going to do that? Well, there's different ways, and Oliver will go into some of the strategies that we can apply.
Yeah, and there really is a huge range of solutions, I feel, that are not properly talked about. The discussion around how we can start to revive hydrological cycles and retain water on the ground tends to revolve around putting in physical, technologically based infrastructure, such as dams and ponds, and those have a place. They definitely do. In fact, we install them regularly. But there are key differences in how we do this as compared to the ones that are impermeable. And we can start to look into working with the entire biology of a space to create water retention landscapes that don't just hold on to water and keep it in a stagnant or impermeable state for a long period of time until it's used again, but those that actually cycle it and create more life, and the water that actually creates more water as well. So let's look into some of these. We're going to go over an extremely large range of options based around a common concept that you'll probably have heard of before, which is slow it, spread it, sink it, and store it. This is very common nomenclature in the permaculture world. And in this picture, you can see my colleague standing in a perfect example of someone who did not slow their water. This is a visit to one of our clients' farms in Portugal. And you can see these all across the landscape, whether you're in the Mediterranean or not. These are head cuts. These are some of the earliest signs of heavy erosion in a landscape. And this means that water has picked up enough force that it has started to channel and erode a portion of, in this case, a pasture. And what happens is this triangle of effects that creates kinetic energy in the water. These are affected by the slope, so it depends on the gradient on the land that you're working with, the quantity of water that is moving through the landscape, and the speed by which it moves. This creates kinetic energy, and with more kinetic energy, water can move larger and larger particles. It starts with basically dust and small bits of clay or bits of organic matter, and moves up to sand, and then gravel, and then stones, and then boulders. And if you've got boulders in your landscape, that means at some point in the past, water has picked up enough kinetic energy to move things that really, really degrade and reshape a landscape. And this is what we want to try and work against when we're slowing the water down. And there are a ton of options for slowing water on a landscape, but they depend on a number of those factors. So like I said, knowing where you are in a landscape, such as in this graphic, will open up some options and will close others. At the top of a watershed, you can start to bring water together and channel it in a way to direct it however you want. Notice there's a big red line there in the collection zone, or the transport zone, where there is too much kinetic energy and it starts to become dangerous to work with water at that stage. And so then we look and lower in the topography for options to divert the erosive force of water and move it back out into the landscape in ways that are beneficial. So There are options like these types of structures where we're using stone to take out the kinetic energy as it starts to move in lower, to prevent it from channelizing streams or digging deeper into the landscape, because every time it goes deeper, it is forming a drain that can no longer rehydrate the other areas. Another thing that is often overlooked is how we manage vegetation on our landscape. This is an example of a mosaic farm landscape from England where hedgerows have a very long history. Some of those hedgerows go back to Roman times and even before and are considered historical monuments. Vegetation not only helps to protect soil by holding through the root matrix, avoiding any kind of erosion that will go through, but it will even cycle it through transpiration and the biotic pump like Nick was talking about earlier. And it's not just a matter of having the surface covered, but also the different strata, the trophic layers of vegetation. And each one of those plays a role in localizing the cycle so that you can create more humidity in the space and keep water not only in the soil, but also moving in the lower atmosphere, making it available to other forms of life. And what if your landscape is already doing horribly and you have trouble just getting vegetation established? Well, then we can use ideally organic mulches. Even though this is dead material, it can help to shade out the soil because, as Nick mentioned, the hotter the soil gets, the less water not only can it hold, but also can it receive. The cooler temperatures of water are able to absorb, of soil are able to absorb water much more easily. So shading it is really important, but also keeping it sheltered from wind. Wind has an incredible desiccating effect. And you may have very rich soil, but the moment that these desiccating winds pass over it, it can dry out extremely quickly. This is actually happening to me right now. We had strong winds today. And even though there was good moisture in the landscape over the last couple of days, I went out to do a quick watering because I knew that any parts that were not mulched were going to dry out really quickly. Let's say you barely have any organic matter on your soil. Well, this is starting even further back. This is a simple technique called pitting, where you're creating texture in the landscape that creates small little areas where organic matter can accumulate, maybe seeds can be deposited, and wind can blow over the top so that these small deposits can form. It's these flat, uncovered, bare landscapes that are the quickest to dry out. And slowly but surely, we begin to mimic the ecosystems that are best known for holding water, which are old growth forests. And if you think about the topography of an old growth forest, over time, these trees have fallen over and created these pit and mound systems that have an incredible amount of diverse topography and texture in them, so that water always has a place to accumulate, to infiltrate in. And there are successional models that are creating different strata of vegetation at many different trophic layers, cycling that within the smaller atmosphere. There's shade to keep the sun off of all of it at many different layers. And you have a microclimate that is very conducive to holding on to moisture anytime that it is received. Now, the opposite of this is one of the most common features on a farm, which are its roads and its access ways. And so in many of the places that we go, these are the biggest forms of erosion that you will find on the landscape. They are kept bare for good reason because you can't drive on them or navigate them much otherwise. And if poorly planned on the landscape, can basically act as erosion channel drains and really compromise the hydrological integrity of your space. That being said, roads can also be used as incredible ways of slowing down water, spreading it over the landscape. And Nick, why don't you tell us about how these can be switched to be a benefit for the hydrology?
Yes, of course. So the main thing with roads is how they are positioned in the landscape. And many times what we see at most of the farms that we visit, the roads are just where it was convenient to drive. The problem is oftentimes this place was at the bottom of a valley or close to the bottom of the valley. And what happens with water? It just flows down. Gravity is pretty simple. So that's a great thing with water. It always does the same thing. So it always tries to go down on the easiest way possible. And if the road is the lowest point, water will just continue flowing and cutting into the road. And what also happens in many places is that many of the roads have also low points. And so what happens in the low point, water accumulates, it sits there and basically starts creating a muddy kind of point. So what we often see in these farms is we have erosion gullies on the road, so you can't drive on them. Every year, people are putting gravel in to fill up the road, which takes a lot of time and also money. And it has to be repeated every year. But one of the simplest things is actually moving the roads to a place that makes more sense on the landscape. So either on the ridges where you have less water, but most importantly, you can use roads to spread water from one place to another. So this is one of the simplest examples here in this picture that we did at one place in Portugal, where we had the road, and this is a very small one, so just for tiny vehicles, so not for big ones, but exactly the same applies for bigger ones, where we had it at a 1% slope. So all the water that is normally just going down and causing problems further down in this valley, now it gets captured and it gets moved into another valley for us to build a pond there. So it's basically refilling a pond instead of causing problems. And this is generally a great idea because you can move water into the places where you want it. And the best thing is that long-term roads might potentially be the only place on the farm where you can still capture road runoff. Because all of us have the goal of building vegetation and building soil that is so soft and so spongy that all the water can infiltrate. The problem is if you design your landscape and have water bodies that from the catchment area are designed to capture all the water from the landscape, if your landscape turns into a sponge, nice and vegetated, and all that water infiltrates, maybe your water bodies don't fill anymore. But the roads, they always stay compacted. So with them, you can always move water along. Sometimes you might not have the benefit of putting a road in, or the road was already there. And I really love this example from an organization called Meta, and it's their drain to gain example. So they're really focused just on roads and what to do with them. And so here the road couldn't be moved and it was causing erosion. But what they did is build a series of channels that are taking water from the road and diverting it into the landscape. So it's spreading it out. And that can also be a great example. If your road is already there, you can't move it. Every few meters, you just work with small ways of bringing water out to the landscape where it can then be used for plants and to grow them. And if we have the benefit of designing a place kind of from scratch, that's in the next example that we have here. This is Mark Shepard's work at his farm. And you can clearly see how the landscape is not just, rows up and down the mountain, but you can see the curves where the landscape is really following the contour. And why he's doing that is that if it wouldn't be the case, you can see here in red, water would just flow down and likely cause problems, specifically in the areas, where you have a lot of rain or you have long dry season followed by strong rain events. And what happens instead now in this landscape is that water needs to take a very long path. So water needs to go from side to side. And there are different techniques of doing this kind of work. So last week there was a presentation on keyline design, where the focus is really on off contour. So that means you don't go perfectly on the contour line, so on one elevation line, but you have it a little bit, some are a bit over the contour, some above. We don't want to go into too much detail now, but the general idea is how can you slow water down and really spread it all over the place. But it's not just about prolonging the way. Another important strategy is decentralization of storage. And so one of my favorite examples here is Tabula Rasa farm that my colleague Zach Weiss worked on. And these are some images from a video that Andrew Millison did to describe the project. And what they did is create a series of connected ponds. So they're decentralized, not just one massive dam that might cause problems, silt up, but this way you have lots of connected ones, and even all the roadways there are beneficial. And so to understand a bit better of how the system works, here's the view from above. You can see from the right, water is captured in one pond, then it gets directed through a road and gets into the system of decentralized ponds. And decentralization is really the key that you can do to water storage, because if more water in different areas, you don't have too much water in one place that might cause problems, and it just looks so much more beautiful than having a massive dam. And you can see here really like the view and how it has changed. And the owners of the farm have said that their grazing has increased. So I think they have over a month more of grazing time now because the water stays much longer in the landscape. And once water gets recharged in groundwater, you can really make a lot of things happen. And, you know, for some, maybe ponds might be a bit much work. So you can also start really simple with just some rocks and building these kind of spreader fans. So that's normally we build these as our spillways. So at the overflow of the water features we're building, but also in other areas where you're seeing water is getting too fast, there's too much of it, you can really spread it out over the landscape in a very simple way. And the best thing about this is every farmer always complains that they have too many rocks on their land. And when you start building these, you will get to a point of loving rocks. So we are now at the point where we can't find enough rocks on the land, and it's really frustrating. So yeah, start building these and you'll never complain about another rock.
And what
With that, I will tell you about.
Yeah, so another really important aspect of spreading water throughout the landscape is actually through biology. We can talk about the technical ways of doing it by literally putting in infrastructure that moves it across areas. And let's face it, moving water is always expensive if you're having to do it mechanically. But if we're leveraging the biology on the site, you can think of wildlife and plants as vectors for the movement of water. In this example of a healthy and a degraded riparian zone of a river, you can see how one style of management causes erosion and drying out of a landscape as the river level starts to drop and erodes the banks out, and vegetation is diminished for a need to get every single little bit of pasture in this case. And sometimes I see it also with crop production all the way up to the edge of a water body. Whereas if you actually make use of those riparian buffers, you can get to a point of deposition and building up of those banks as the vegetation in the riparian zone actually acts as a sieve and collects some of the sediment and increases not only the fertility of the soil, but the potential for life then. And maybe it's through grazing animals that come down and drink from that area and then go out further into the landscape to eat, where they dung and they urinate, which is essentially fertilizer-rich irrigation. But also, even if you're not managing livestock, this can happen with wildlife. And, you know, many of us here have the goal of increasing biodiversity on our farms. And there is no single thing that you can do to better increase biodiversity than have clean surface water available on your land. This is where everything that is living comes to congregate, right? Everything needs clean water to drink. And if it is few sources and far between, there's not going to be a whole lot of life in the space in between. But going back to what Nick said about decentralized, even small water bodies, these can become vectors for moisture along larger areas of your landscape. And during longer and longer periods into the seasons, even after precipitation has gone away. And that takes us to sinking water into the landscape. This is an interesting graphic where someone has used dye in the water so that you can actually see its movement through the subsoil layers. And you can see how infiltration is quite good there at the top, and it starts to peter out as the ground becomes more compacted and the different strata underneath the top layer changes. But these are very simple experiments that you can do yourself. And I'll talk about some others as well. But before we go into that, let's talk about some of the main reasons why a landscape can no longer sink water. The main ones are compaction from machinery, the plow pan effect of constant tillage. So even if you're not losing topsoil from constant tillage and movement of the top layer, you are at least compacting the subsoil layer beneath it. So to the tune of the depth at which that machinery is going to be tilling, it is loosening up the soil at the top for sure, but it is also compacting the layer underneath it. And so you might have nice fluffy soil at the top. You think, oh, this is going to receive water very well. And as soon as you put a probe down in there, you hit a plow pan, and water and therefore roots as well cannot penetrate deeper down there. Beyond the machinery, we also have overgrazing, which is a very common thing all around the world. And this is an example from a farm that we visited in Portugal. This was during a rainstorm. And you can see there is almost no vegetation in this area, as cattle have been set stock grazed there for quite some time. And the only vegetation you see is in a mucky kind of putrid wetland area where the cows can't actually access it because their hoofs get sunk in. And this is, of course, going to compact the ground and decrease its ability to infiltrate anything. And of course, despite these, just having bare soil, if anyone's heard of capping, as soon as a droplet of water hits the surface, it'll disturb or spread out the tiny little particles of soil, which will then condense on the top, making for that kind of ceramic layer. Even if it cracks, at the moment that clay gets wet, it'll expand again and create an impermeable layer on the top. So partly removing these practices from the landscape is going to help out a lot. But now we can look into how to actually test to see if this is a problem in your own soil. Now, I've produced 2 videos specifically in the climate farmers community to figure out whether you have compaction and the infiltration rate of your soil. You can use any number of simple probes that I know all of you guys have access to already. If you don't have a little soil probe like the one on the right, you can use a shovel. And depending on how hard and how deep it is you can get down into your soil, that will give you an indication as to whether or not water can move down there quickly either. The next one is to do a simple infiltration test. And again, the instructions, there's a whole video on this that I can share the link to. You can find it in our YouTube channel. And it's just a matter of using one of these cylinders, pounding it into the ground, giving a metered amount of water and timing how long it takes for it to disappear. And there's also a range in which, you have good infiltration, medium, or poor infiltration that will give you a sense of how urgent it'll be for you to take some action on the ground so that this is improved. Now, one of the main ones that we're all familiar with about how to increase the infiltration rate of soil is to increase organic matter. And it's well known at this point that just a 1% increase in soil organic matter can increase the soil's water holding capacity by approximately 150,000 to 230,000 liters per hectare. This is not a small amount, but it is a relatively small increase or change in the organic matter of your soil. Another thing that's becoming increasingly known and talked about in soil health is aggregate. And this is a matter of whether or not your soil is stable in water. The combination of the exudates of bacteria and fungi create a compound called glomulin, which is essentially a glue that holds soil particulate matter together. And it's very stable in water. This is one of the best things that you can do to avoid erosion on a landscape, because as it is saturated, as it is wetted with precipitation, if there is no biological glue, this glomulin to hold it together, this is when particles become suspended in water and are lost to the system. This is part of where the many, many tons per hectare on average of topsoil loss is happening every single year. And so this is a simple aggregate slake test that you can do to see if you have good aggregate in your soil. And increasingly, it's important to check it at lower and lower levels, not just the top profile of your soil. And I'm going to keep harping on this, but vegetation is absolutely crucial to this. Exudates from roots in all types of vegetation feed the soil food web and create the conditions to have this glomulin, to have more and more short and long chain carbons in the soil that attract water, that act as a sponge. And these simple sugars, I don't know if you've ever had a little canister of sugar out on a table uncovered before, but within a matter of hours, sometimes it'll create a little crust on the top, and that's because of how quickly it absorbs moisture. Well, think about the kilos and tons of simple sugars that are being pumped into the soil that hold that water, just like salts and sugars that we know of, that create this retention soil that stays hydrated for longer. And as we start to add more and more trophic levels of vegetation, we're creating that shade, we're creating that protection from the wind, and we're creating the smaller cycle of moisture in the atmosphere at the level of the ground. This changes even how we feel our temperature. And there's a little graphic there in the top corner. It's important to know that wind shielding is not just a matter of putting a wall of vegetation. Oftentimes, it'll force air down underneath and cause even stronger wind currents. It's important to create a sort of ramp so that air is pushed to the top and you get shelter down below. And of course, Shade is not just important, any protection is not just important for plants. Livestock need it too. You can dramatically decrease the amount of stress and the amount of water that livestock need in the warmer season by having shade vegetation in regular intervals throughout your pasture. Is one of the things that we're most passionate about doing to accompany the interventions, the actions for retention, such as ponds and terraces that we do for farmers, is to follow that up with plantings, even in pastures, to increase the protection, the shade, and the comfort conditions for livestock as well as vegetation. And this isn't just for small farms that are highly diverse. This is just as workable for large-scale arable operations. This is one of the most famous and well-known pictures of an operation in France where they're growing rows of poplars in between wheat. And this has tons of benefits, not only for the hydrology in the soil through the extension of the roots of the trees, but also the shade in the high season helps the growth rate of the crop that they're farming. And through careful planning and design, you can do so in a way that it's just as easy for machinery to get in there for the efficiency of planting and harvesting.
Yeah, when we look at storage, now that's the kind of the last piece in the puzzle, is how we can also store that water. And there are also different techniques that we kind of want to highlight here. And one of the probably most beneficial in terms of biodiversity, but also having water available for different plants, and in general, just for your farm, but also for beauty, you can also use them for swimming, is definitely ponds. And natural ponds, it's also what we are focusing on. So generally you can build them without liners. So it's just with clay, if you have enough clay in the soil. And the great thing about these is that they are completely connected to the aquifer. So these kind of ponds, because they always let a little bit of water out back into the soil, they're an important part to recharge soil also further down. Also, if you have pasture further down, it's also another great thing because water slowly moves there and you can build them. In some cases, you might not have any clay on site, or just the clay content is so little. And then it might also make sense to work with a liner so that you include it in there so that you have it really impermeable, and then you integrate the spillway, so the overflow, into other systems. And it's just a fantastic way, specifically when you integrate them. And one other thing that is completely overlooked somehow on farms, like almost always when I'm visiting farms, the roofs are not connected to any storage. And especially in dry areas on the Iberian Peninsula, there it's so important to store that water, but also in the wetter areas. Free water comes from the sky all the time. In some areas, it might only happen occasionally, but even then it's more important to store really everything. And this is an example. This is from my place. This is a flexible water tank, and it's kind of like a big pillow. And this one can hold 50,000 liters, so 50 cubic meters. And that's quite a bit of water. And so with this, if I fill this up throughout the rainy season, it's almost enough to get me through the year. And when you look at your farms and the areas there, many farms have 500 to 1,000 square meters of roof surface easily. And if you have 1,000 meters of roof, just 1 millimeter of rain is almost 1,000 liters that you can store. And so 1 millimeter of rain is nothing. So you can really store a lot of water. So specifically, if you need water for livestock, but also for market gardens and other operations where you need water, you can easily store as much water as you need. So you can really reduce your amount of pumping from the ground. But also in the ground, there's different techniques. And one great one is wetlands. So we often think of ponds, as these nice with dam walls and all this, but often the wetland. And here, this is one example from our mentor and colleague Tom Biewighauser. He's building wetlands all over the place, and they're basically in the ground. So you often don't even see any kind of wall. So the impermeable clay layer can be built below the soil. Maybe they don't hold water throughout the whole year, and they're just there from times, and they can spread out water throughout the year. And for wildlife and just in general for ecosystem health, wetlands are incredible and a fantastic tool that can be used. Another one that you can go into that often requires a little bit more work, but can also be simple, like in this example, is just working with terraces. So this one, we just work with a tiny excavator. It's a really small terrace, But with this terrace, we can bring water from one valley where we had too much water, where on this place it was causing erosion. And in the other valley, we built an infiltration pond where we wanted that water. So now with this terrace, we can bring water much further from one place to the other. And depending on how the landscape is designed, in a few days, you can really design a beautiful landscape that circulates water from one place to another with a gentle slope. And it's fantastic if you have these terraces just for vegetation. But as I mentioned earlier, these terraces can have even more purpose. And that's when you use the terraces as roads. And so this is the example from Tabula Rasa farm that I talked about earlier, where Zach worked with his team. And you can see here on the right, this is a pond. And then you see the road going there. So now if we look at it from above, the point with the arrow, that's where the picture was taken. And it takes water from this point where a lot of water was accumulated in that valley, and it refills the pond system that they built in the other valley. And they even built in circulation pumps, and you can kind of see how water then moves throughout the landscape. And if you need to build roads on your farm, or if you have roads that are not really working, you could slightly reposition them, regrade them, and they can turn from an erosive nightmare that costs you a lot of money in repair every year to super beneficial. If you want to work directly in the landscape, there's also a very simple technique. This is at one place where we just spent 2 hours. We had a little bit of more excavator time, and we didn't have time for proper measuring and lasering. So we just went for the simple technique called continuous contour trenches, where basically you just dig more or less on contour these trenches that kind of act like long little bathtubs, but they're only a few meters long. So water can spill into them, and when one layer is full, they overflow kind of into the next layer, and that way you can really slow water down in your landscape. And the good thing is, because they don't hold a lot of water, if they're not perfect, it doesn't really matter. They can not really cause a lot of damage. And if you really want to work in a way without moving earth, there's also different ways. And so here on the left, the Slauens from Gut und Bösel in Germany, you might know it. And there it's really a diverse agroforestry system. So they have their syntropic rows there that are working fantastically. And so in these kind of soils and these kind of environments, water can infiltrate. And there's the famous picture in the middle that probably all of you have seen, just a grassland and the depth of roots that it can have. So soil is your best storage of water by far. So make sure all of the water gets into it, nothing gets lost. And then on the right, it's also from Gut und Böse. So you can work with trees. You can also work with different cropping techniques or with animals. So it's really up to you how you want to bring that water into the landscape. It's just important that there's one word of caution, because with great machines also comes great responsibility. Because kind of when you're working with your hands and you're working on small systems, it's really easy to learn how water behaves, and also when systems are full, and how to build spillways. The problem is when you're making your first experiments already with big machines and you haven't quite figured out how soil works, or you don't have enough kind of experience in these kind of fields, some of these dams can also break. So there's a really word of caution before you start holding a lot of water. Really spend some time learning how to do it right. Maybe work with someone who has a bit more experience and gain your experience on smaller things. Just because you have an excavator or a tractor or maybe bulldozer doesn't mean you should always use it. Build small systems by hand first, and then you can move up to bigger things. And kind of the 3 things that I would always advise is you need to love to learn to go out when it rains. So it's my favorite time by far to go outside. It's the best. You can really see where's water flowing, where is it accumulating, where can you maybe intervene and do something with it. Then you also need to learn a bit more about reading different plants and what they mean for water. So this at the middle is at Manuel Farm, Manuel Troya. We were there recently to start on a water design, and these sedges are growing in a super dry area, but they generally just grow when there's water below the surface. So that's one place where we're definitely going to do something, because we know there's water there, you just can't see it. It might just be, 20, 30 centimeters below the surface. And if you learn to read your land, you can really do a lot in movement and kind of slightly changing the trajectory of water. And then on the right, it's one of the spillways that we built for one of the ponds, really getting to work with rocks. Many times when you have erosion problems, really paying attention to how water moves and then working with rocks to spread that erosion is a fantastic tool. And as I said earlier, you will really learn to love rocks. And especially if you have volunteers, this is a perfect use for volunteers. So try to get them to move your rocks. And I think with those kind of general ideas, you already have an idea where to start. And now how to really go into a holistic water management plan and the steps there, Ollie will go into a bit more detail.
Yeah, so everything that we've covered now is all well and good, but you need to know how to put it together and what criteria you should be evaluating to figure out which one of these options is actually appropriate for you. So there are some steps that we work with constantly with our clients and even on our own properties to create a holistic water management plan. And I'm going to quickly go through these 4 elements, and we can go through some of this in the Q&A afterwards. We've got plenty of time. We're going to go for an extra half an hour after the hour, so don't worry about it. The first one, of course, is defining your unique context. This is relevant to everything that we do with land management, whether it's farming, whether it's ecosystem restoration, whatever it is. From there, you really need to learn to observe your site. Just like what Nick was talking about, being out there all the time, and we'll go into these in a little bit more detail. And then I'll give you some key questions to answer to start to guide your thinking in your evaluation process of which of the options might be appropriate for you, and use all of this information that we are going to gather to develop a holistic plan of action and reflection. So, of course, there's the definition of a unique context. You got to start by building an understanding of your place and your time. I really like to consider it as a story of place, which is a term coined by the Regenesis group. And it really is a story, right? It is alive. It's ongoing. It is much more complex than just a list of stats. I think there's a general misunderstanding, even today in the regen ag movement, that when you ask someone what their context is, they just list off how much water or rainfall they get each year, what their soil texture is like, where they are in their geography, and that's my context. It is so much deeper than that, and the deeper you go, the more useful you will find that your context will help you with in decision making. From there, you got to identify the decision makers, the resources, and the restrictions that you are working with. This helps to set parameters on what you're doing. And if you are not coordinating with all of the different decision makers, there will inevitably be people rowing in different directions, and you will miss out on the efficiency of really getting everyone on the same page. From there, we have to determine the quality of life that you're pursuing. Let's face it, if you're in farming to try and get rich and are focused just on the finances, you are missing the biggest potential of the lifestyle that goes along with being a stewardship of the land. And quite frankly, there's easier ways to make money. And so knowing what the quality of life that you're pursuing is can really make all the difference in where you put your efforts and how you make decisions. And from there, we have to define what we need to produce or acquire to achieve the quality of life and really understand why your organization exists. What is the real reason for being together and pursuing what it is that you're working on? That's much more important than figuring out just how the finances shake out at the end of the day. Now, when we go into site observation, like Nick mentioned before, you have to be present on land. There is so much work and research that we're able to do now remotely that people often think that you can surrogate decision-making with just the information you can gather remotely, and that's just not the case. All of these are stats, and even the maps and all of the different overlays that you can find now are not the landscape. It's a relationship, it's an understanding that you need to start to build an awareness of, and many of you here listening are experts at this already. So knowing where you are on the landscape in elevation, relative elevation, the geography that you're working with, and how that affects the plant communities, what sources of water exist specifically, where they are, and what quality or quantity and variation of flow do they exist in. We're not just talking about rainwater. Obviously, that's always going to be a factor, but if you've got wells, if you've got wetlands, if you've got any other type of surface water, or knowing how deep your access to groundwater is. What does the landscape tell you about how water moves and is stored or shed in some cases? We're looking for signs of erosion. We're looking for deposition of sediment and organic matter. We're looking for signs of movement across the landscape that can tell us where we might be able to effectively intervene and put in something to increase the efficacy of the cycle. Where is your landscape in its succession? What is it moving towards? Is it stuck that it can't move forward because of some of the management practices that we're doing? Can we accelerate those in some ways? And there's always biological indicators here. And what disturbance regimes influence that trajectory? So obviously, if we're tilling or cultivating the land, that's going to set it back in its succession. We can also move it forward, but also there's natural forces such as storms and fires and erosion that are natural disturbance regimes. And the main thing to understand here is the deterrence of disturbance is a form of disturbance in itself. Perfect example of the suppression of wildfires up to a certain point where fuel loads build up. And then when fire finally does come back into the landscape, you have catastrophic ones that are no longer a cleaning effect of the landscape. They're a destructive effect, right? And there are many other examples, but I won't go too deep into this just now. The key questions that I really like to ask that give me insight into how we might be able to combine and evaluate the options that we have are, where is water needed and how much do we need and in what quality? So for different operations or enterprises on a farm, this is going to result in different answers. If it's transportation for watering troughs, you're probably going to need fairly high quality water for cattle or livestock. Whereas if it's dispersant for irrigation for crops, you could probably get away with pretty poor quality water. In fact, there are lots of examples of increasingly farms using wastewater from animals or from industrial processes to irrigate. So there are different needs for every different enterprise, and knowing that sets a good starting point for making decisions. What points of inefficiency and waste exist in your current water management? And what water infiltration opportunities exist? The size, the cost, the type of hierarchy, et cetera, are going to give you insights as to where opportunities lie. What water storage opportunities exist? Similarly, going into the specifics on those, and what water reuse and recycling opportunities exist. This helps us to look at all of the range of options and how they can be combined. And now putting all of this together into a holistic plan is a lot more than just coming up with a roadmap and executing it. You need to combine your learnings from the creation of your unique context and the integral assessment of your land and water needs. It's the combination of those things that's going to give you specific and unique solutions for what you're working on. And then from there, you need to research and select the options for water management that fit your context and available resources. Then move to create small experiments. That's like Nick was warning about the dangers of getting in too fast with machinery and making really large investments before you know how it's actually going to work. Starting really small and running experiments is going to ensure that you don't make those types of catastrophic mistakes and lose resources in the attempt. You also need to constantly observe and review the effects of your actions in order to adapt the evolution of the ecosystem and the context. Ideally, the things that you're going to do are going to work, and it's going to cause pretty rapid changes in your landscape as you start to retain more water. And that is going to require an adaptation, a change in an evolution of your plan very quickly. So a static plan is not going to work for any long period of time. It's a relationship, it's an adaptation that's going to make for a holistic plan. And from there, I highly encourage all of you to share your learnings and your success with your community, inspire others and offer support to others in their efforts. That's how we're going to get to do this on a much larger scale. And really, that brings us to the highest potential of what you can do with your landscape, because you will very quickly, when you start to implement a plan like this, reach some of the upper limits of what you can do within property boundaries. And quite frankly, the real potential of working with water is through collaboration and moving into the community scope. Because let's face it, water is a communal resource. If you have any kind of body of water like a lake or a river or working from an aquifer, those are never isolated to a single property. And only through collaboration and working with entire communities can you really reach the potential of creating whole regions that retain and cycle water effectively. And look, I know we just covered so much stuff and we did so in an extremely superficial way, mostly to give you an idea of the range of options and all of the considerations that go into effective water management. But we are also planning on using each one of these little sections that we covered today in a larger series that goes deep into each one to create better understanding as well as the evaluation criteria for selecting how to actually work with it yourself. So look out for those in the coming weeks and months. And in the meantime, I'm going to open it up for questions and a discussion here. But you can always reach out to me, well, obviously through the community here. It's one of my favorite discussions to have. We've got a channel in our WhatsApp group specifically for water management. It's a great way to have that discussion there. But I also encourage you to reach out to us individually. Nick's brand through Permanick and his website there. My own through Regenerative Skills. And if you know that already, it's probably through the podcast. And we're just about to announce a collaborative effort that we're doing with another soil expert in our group called Agua Abundancia, which is going to focus our efforts on restoring the hydrological cycle of the Iberian Peninsula. And that is a placeholder for now, but the website is live, so feel free to check that out. In the meantime, we will be launching that towards the end of the year. And yeah, we've got another half an hour, so please go ahead and either put your questions or comments in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand and let's get this started. Yes, my cam was a little blurred. Thank you, Roberto. At the same time, every day, the sun comes right in through that window, and the way that the camera is positioned just makes it really weird. But I'm back. Marcelo.
Well, hi, Oliver. Hi, Nick. Hi, everybody. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. That was excellent, very comprehensive. I think I'm in the pool of colleagues that are very familiar with the topic. But so my question is not so much on the content. I think that was very clear. I mean, the importance, the need. And now as a farmer, so I mean, I'm also in Portugal. The current fire that just happened like 15 days ago, last week, stopped 500 meters from the land. So we're very lucky. But I can see all of the processes that you guys mentioned, especially you, Nick, on the fire, the drought, and the flood cycle. Well, we'll be coming there in the next week to take a look. My question is more, so I do understand that there is no one size fits all for the solutions that we have in terms of water harvesting. I mean, I do follow, of course, Andrew Millison, and I'm very familiar with water harvesting from Brad Lancaster and so on. Here, it's more like a plea to both of you. So how can we scale this out beyond, like within the climate farmers and also beyond? So there is, we're always very curious about not so much the science, but the costs and the operational aspect of implementing some of those oftentimes very context-specific interventions on the ground, right? So I think more perhaps of like a higher level thinking, we perhaps as climate farmers, we should start trying to document the implementation of those technologies on the ground in a more comprehensive and holistic way. I posted here on the chat the World Database on Conservation Practices. This is well, proof by the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification and Land Degradation, and they use this database as kind of like a way to promote sustainable land management, which is exactly what you're doing through the climate farmers and in this channel specifically now for the water. Could we try to document some of those excellent works that we do at farm level in Portugal and Spain? So we would have like a place to refer back to and say like, look, this specific landscape, this specific slope, specific type of soil, specific stakeholder, specific water regime, and in that specific case, this has been documented, and you can find that here. It's not the best for your land, but at least it's documented for that area. So try to think of like, can we further document and turn that local farmer knowledge that we have into something that we can, even as climate farmers, promote as like, oh, this is the climate farmers' contribution to a database based on what our community is doing. Just as an idea, but in terms of content, the work, it's all very clear. I have actually reached out to Nick. I have erosion issues in my land as well. Might reach out for us to do some earthworks there to look into it. Very shallow bedrock, but we'll get into that some other time. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Marcelo. Yeah, so, Nick and I are engaged in quite a bit of projects and educational events in the upcoming months. Nick, you can talk more about yours. I have a course, a 2-day course that I'm going to be giving with La Junquera, which I should have mentioned earlier, on holistic water management. And that's one of the best sites that I know of in Europe that is documenting very well the efficacy and the results of many different types of water retention features and practices. So I don't know that the solution is to get more data. I think if more data was the thing that was missing for progress, we would be having more progress than ever before rather than more degradation, because we have access to more information and more case studies than ever before. So I would question more not getting an increasing amount of data and information, but making it more digestible, the stuff that we already do have, right? And quite frankly, I'm convinced that that is more effectively done through stories than through databases. Databases are really good for reference. They're really good for informing policy making and backing up claims. But I also think that this needs to be more approachable and digestible for the majority of people who are looking for inspiration and who are not likely to find it in a list of statistics. So, I mean, you know, we consume a lot of the same media and inspiration you're talking about, Andrew Millicent, and I'm sure we've seen tons of similar YouTube videos. From what I have heard, and where a lot of people come to reach out to us from, is from inspiration that they got from those sources. For better or for worse, that's where a lot of people are consuming their information at the moment. And the things that tend to catch onto people's imagination and get them to dream about what's possible is through a different way of expressing the findings and telling the stories of what is possible and what has been achieved in some of the most drastic and sort of crisis moments that we have access to. Nick, where would you say to that?
Yeah, on the one side, I agree that story-based just makes a lot of sense, and we need the inspiration to get started. I think we do need probably a bit more data on the results of these specific stories, though, because so as soon as we get into bigger projects and with larger investments and those kind of projects, yeah, they're always interested. Okay, what are the KPIs? You know, what are you measuring? What's the return on investment? If I put now thousands of euros into machine hours, like what will that return? So I think there makes a lot of sense to say, like, okay, in this context, this kind of investment led to this kind of increase in, you know, or decrease in fire hazard or these kind of things. So I think it depends a lot on the project, but it definitely can't hurt. So I would say the most important thing is we just need to do more projects. So instead of just focusing on collecting more, we just need to be out there on the excavators and on the bulldozers to actually build these landscapes. And where I fully agree is we need to document everything, measure everything properly, to then, you know, have clear data to show, like, okay, this is what we did and this is what it led to.
Yeah, and along those lines too, we are working on creating resources for really simple measurements and tracking that people can do even for the small projects, like at a backyard basis, right? It could be as simple as the effects or the quality of water that comes from, let's say, a rain garden, all the way up to full water retention landscape implementation at farms. And it's just a matter of, and this is why I always go back to the definition of a context. What is it that you're trying to gain from that system? Because if you're measuring things that, quite frankly, are not that interesting to you, like it could be water quality, it could be quantity of water, but what you're actually looking for is better growth of grass, right? I always try and make sure that the things that we're measuring, the things that we're paying attention to, have a direct correlation with something that is felt and achieved that represents progress for the people who are making the investment in these things.
No, thanks. I like the story-based approach as well. Actually, use a lot of that. It's just yeah, I agree with you. The documentation is like, it's easier to convince people with data sometimes, but it's easier to convince farmers with stories. I think if you want to sell a project, they want to see, as Nick indicated, the numbers. But of course, the peer farmer learning is the best way to promote sustainable land management. The issue is, for example, if there's an extension service, for example, for a specific district, and you want to train an extension officer that visits the farmers and try to bring some of that knowledge. So, I mean, in the absence of a peer farmer learning, like the climate farmers or a farmer field school, for example, some of those documented practices can help a lot. But yeah, note taken, I think we need to tackle the problem from all of the sides. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And one more thing that I'll say on the caution of data is that it often hides the larger nuance and creates expectations that can't necessarily be recreated, right? In fact, we work with this with clients a lot where, they're asking, okay, well, if I install this, what can I expect as far as water infiltration in the first season? And I'm like, well, look, that's going to depend on how much it rains, how you manage the soil around the feature, what your grazing practices are, so many other things, right? And this is why I'm talking about stories, because stories have the opportunity to create this type of nuance. And just because something works out and gives you that data that you were hoping for doesn't necessarily mean it's going to repeat in another implementation of a project. I mean, there's so much that can determine the efficacy of an installation that is below ground that a lot of people don't even look at before they start doing their installation. It's one of the ways that we differentiate ourselves, by taking test slices and really studying the geology below ground to see the feasibility of the installation of some of these things. And I don't know how robust a database would need to be to include all of that nuance into it, and then to make a claim that that could be repeated somewhere else. So it's useful up to a point, and it is necessary for certain types of conversations, but I'm also very careful when I speak about, okay, here's data that you're referencing, that doesn't mean that that's what you're going to get, or it might not mean that you'll be limited by it on the other side too. Ivo.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. Would love to try and book the two of you for a conversation with the OP2B team that are currently trying to set the outcomes for regenerative agriculture, and the water metric is reduction of blue water extraction for regenerative agriculture. And I've been telling them, like, no, it needs to be the addition of green water. And they promised me a conversation in the next couple of weeks, and would love to have the two of you there. I think you can make that case much better than me. Question much more practical than on the larger level. My piece of land, I have a place where I want to dig a pond, and I don't have the machinery to dig a test slice. So, and I don't know, can't drive an excavator. So before I go through all of this, I'd love to know whether it's a good idea to do this. Any smarter idea than digging a test slice by hand?
You kind of asked the right question, like, is it a good idea to do that? I think that's the main thing. So figuring out, okay, why exactly do we want a pond, and why in that location?
I want a pond because I want to store more water on the landscape. And in that location, because that's where water collects, and I would expect that it would be a good place to store water.
That's a really good place to start. Yeah.
One thing, like, so why I'm asking this is because quite often, like, to get more water into the landscape, ponds are they're really visual, so they always come to mind. But sometimes you can store even more water directly in the soil. So it depends a lot of, do you basically just need water for trees? So do you need the water to be available for trees? And then if it's below ground and you can't see it, great. So then, you might have much easier techniques of just spreading the water around and kind of infiltrating it in a larger area. If you also need it as kind of available water so that you can physically grab it, then I think in your areas you don't have any buildings, right? Because then sometimes, just having a roof or something, and then storage can be one. For the pond, if you want to get at least an idea, what you can do is with the spade. So you can dig a little bit down so you get a bit of an idea, is it clay-ish soil or is it super sandy? And also, it doesn't need to seal perfectly. You know, so that's also one thing where if you have some clay there and you can compact it, what you can do is just dig, kind of use it as a gym. So, you know, by hand, you're never going to get anything that really holds a lot of water. So look at it more as exercise and then more as an infiltration basin. So basically there you would try to dig out as much and compact as much, and you just have a place for water to infiltrate. Otherwise, it really depends. You need to look at kind of input output, you know, so digging a complete pond by hand is so much work, and the likelihood of being able to compact it sufficiently by hand that it really holds water is quite low. You know, so if you want to work that way, so you need the heavy machines and compactors to really, and then you need to compact usually between like 70, 80 centimeters of soil, of clay, really heavily compacted. And that's, you know, just basically your impermeable layer. So it's a lot of work. So, you know, maybe you can work with a series of different infiltration basins, rain gardens, you know, so just when it rains, water goes from one place to the next, and you connect lots of small features. That might be a bit better investment if you want to do it by hand. Otherwise, if having fresh water available, you might also look into working with a liner there, because yeah, compaction by hand is really, really difficult. And if you bury the liner 20 centimeters deep, you don't even see it. And then at least, you know, you have some water if that's the main priority.
That's great. That would have been my second question, because I have a second location that is very clay, that I have dug out by hand, that does hold some water, but it does disappear, which I'm partly happy with. And I'm considering if I ever wanted to seal it, my question would have been, how would you do that? Liner. Thank you.
And one real quick hack. I know the parcel where you have, there's quite a lot of topography in the area. There's a good chance that if you go along the roads anywhere near you, they're cut out of the landscape. And many of them will be 1 or 2 meters or so. That's as good as a test slice, right?
Interesting.
Yep, I do that around here all the time, and we're in the mountains. Every road has a massive gash on it somewhere, and this is how I know that I have nothing except for granite sand.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And yeah, okay. How often do you encounter areas where, let's say on like one area you have a lot of clay, let's say 50 meters, a different area, you have a completely different type of soil, or would you expect it roughly to be the same?
So where you tend to find that is in urban areas where soil has been moved around a lot to plane things and get it ready for construction, and also in areas of like intensive agriculture. But I can also show you where we can get, I have actually the maps of the geology of Catalonia, and they're very precise.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just one thing, one word of advice there. When one of the features we built, we were doing test slices and we just couldn't find a lot of clay. So we decided, okay, there's not enough clay here. Let's go for an infiltration basin instead for a sealed pond. And then when we dug the spillway, so basically we built the overflow a few meters away from the main pond to really get the water away and not have any problems. And while we were digging the spillway, we found pure clay, a meter thick. We're like, great, now that we're done with the pond, we find the clay. And that was a difference of 5 meters. Right. So yeah, you can really have these pockets of perfect clay right next to. That's why test slices are so useful.
Got it. Thanks. Super helpful.
Nice. Any last questions before we wrap up here today? Obviously, both Nick and I are very active in the community, so if any other questions come up, we're more than happy to discuss them there. And we are in the process of creating more presentations that go into the specific sections that we glossed over today. There's a lot more to be said about each one of those, and I hope that we can bring some more inspiration and options for you guys who are struggling with any type of water issue. Well, cool. Let's wrap it up for today. Thank you for those of you who stayed with us this long, and I look forward to continuing this chat in the community. Take care, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Ciao.